Okay, hi again, guys. So we're going to move away from urban now. And another part of human geography is this idea of economic world for AQA, or development dynamics, if you're with Edexcel. And with that, we're going to explore the fact that the world is very unevenly developed. Okay, some places in the world are very affluent and wealthy, and some places are extremely poor, even to this day. How we can measure that? How do we actually know that that's the case? What's caused it? And what are the impacts or consequences of this, what we're trying to do to fix the problem, and then how Kenya, which is an example or a case study you could use, how Kenya is using tourism to reduce the development gap or bridge the gap or just close the gap. These are phrases the examiners like to use. In other words, make countries more developed and richer. Okay, now I'm not going to read all these out to you. I definitely would be pausing it and making some notes, but these are all the different ways that we can measure development, and students need to know. These are sometimes social and economic. There was a 2-marker just this year, which was literally like define birth rate. And you would only get 2 marks if you said what it means, but also the actual rate. So that's the second part. So for example, birth rate means the number of births each year. That would be 1 mark, but you'd have to say per 1,000 people. Okay, and you'd need to be aware, what does that actually show? Well, if a country has a very high birth rate, that means they're probably very poor, like a low-income country, because it means they've got very poor contraception, or they need to have lots of children to work on the farms, that primary industry. But again, we would say this is per 1,000, so we're looking for a high number. Similarly, death rates, again, if you've got high death rates, it's going to tell you that a country is probably quite poor again, because it means they've got very poor healthcare. You've got life expectancy. Infant mortality rate means the number of babies per 1,000 that don't make it to the age of 1, which is a really sad one. Again, the higher the number, the poorer the country. We've got things like literacy rate, which is how many students or people can read or write a basic sentence at the age of 15. So they're the more social ones. Then you've got some economic ones, like GNI and GNI per capita, which basically mean the same thing. It's all to do with money in the country, but we divide it by the people. Now, I've not mentioned the HDI, and that's because I'm going to focus on that one in a second. It is the best indicator of development, and students need to know that, because each of the others do have some flaws. Okay, for example, birth rate is not great, because yes, it does tell us if it's high, they're quite poor, because they have limited healthcare. However, you might live in Mexico, where the fact that they're all Catholics means they've got extremely high birth rates because they don't believe in contraception. But that doesn't mean they're poor. In fact, they are a newly emerging economy. They're quite wealthy now. Death rate, just look at the UK during COVID. If you were an alien coming from outer space and you looked at the death rate for the UK that year and didn't know anything else, you would assume that the UK is extremely poor because the death rate was so high. But we just didn't deal with it properly, did we, as a country? Okay. GNI doesn't tell you where the money's coming from. It could be through corruption or selling weapons. So they have come up with the HDI, and the HDI is the best development indicator, because it takes into account 3 of the other ones. So it takes into account life expectancy, so how long you're expected to live. In this country, it is 78 for a man and 81 for a woman. Well done, women. Better life choices, healthier, for example, less manual labour jobs. Years in school. So in this country, we have to be in education until we're 18. And GNI per capita, so how much money there is divided by the people. And this is what it looks like in the world. Norway is the best country in the whole world in terms of its HDI, the Human Development Index. It gives you a score from 0 to 1, and I think Norway is going to be like 0.97 or something like that. Okay, the UK is still like 0.9, but it hasn't made the top 10. Australia's up there, New Zealand, the US have done quite well. Okay, so it means that they're really healthy, generally, these countries. They're going to live to a long age. They've got good education systems, and they've got lots of money divided by the people. And then you've got lots of countries down here right at the bottom, and I think you can all agree that most of those are based in Africa, okay, which means they've got really poor healthcare. They don't stay at school very long, if they go to school at all, and they don't have a lot of money. Okay, and it's not without its flaws. The HDI is still, like all of them, if you're looking for a quick win, I'd be saying this. Okay, each of these just looks at the country as a whole. They don't take into account regional differences. So any of those, if you got a question in your exam, a limitation of birth rate, just say doesn't take into account regional differences, which means, in this country, in the south of the UK, you're expected to live longer, so your life expectancy is higher. Whereas in the north, you're not going to live as long. It's about 5 years different. So again, life expectancy does not take into account regional differences. It just looks at the country as a whole, as does the HDI. Okay, so why is this the case then? Why is the UK so wealthy compared to places like in Africa? And these are the causes students need to be aware of. And notice how I've categorized these into physical or environmental, economic to do with money, and historical. And this could be a 4 marker, it could be a 6 marker. Explain the physical causes of uneven development, or assess the causes for 6 marks, where you'd have to choose, which ones are the most significant, for example. And you need to be aware of most of these. Okay, so being landlocked means that you are a country in the middle of a big landmass, like in Central Africa, like the Central African Republic, the CAR, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Mali, if you want to remember a shorter one, Mongolia over in Asia. These countries are generally quite poor because they can't get to the sea for trade. Natural resources, if you are lucky enough to have oil, like in the Middle East, you're going to be rich because you can sell it. Everything about the Middle East says they should be poor. They have war and conflict. They have corrupt governments in some places, okay, and they have poor climate, which, should be another kind of physical one. So the climate, they have droughts regularly, okay, but they've got oil, and that overrides all of the others because they can export that oil to the West and make ridiculous money. Natural disasters, if you live in a country like the Philippines that gets all sorts of tropical storms and volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis, how are you ever going to develop? Your schools are getting destroyed, your factories are getting destroyed. Okay, so that's going to have a massive impact on the country's ability to develop. Debt, some countries are in massive debt. Angola owes China £30 billion a year. How are they ever going to become richer and more developed if they are giving more money out to paying off debts to other countries than actually developing the country? The government might be corrupt, like in Venezuela, okay, and places like that where they just don't run the country properly. They don't invest in healthcare and education and infrastructure. War and conflict. Again, similarly to natural disasters, look at Ukraine right now, look at Israel and Gaza, all the buildings that are getting destroyed, the people that are dying, that's schools. People can't go to school, they're not going to get an education. Factories are being destroyed. People are dying, which means they're not working, so they're not investing into the local economy. Okay, so these are some of the economic causes. And then there's more historical ones. I put war up there again because it could be a war that's happened in the past. It's still having an impact. When Ukraine gets through this, it's going to take them years to get back to where they were. And colonization, this idea of a colony like the British Empire, taking over countries and exploiting them for all of their natural resources like we did many years ago. Okay. On the flip side, we have got trade agreements with those countries now, so there are some positives, but generally the negatives outweigh them because we exploited a lot of their raw materials by owning those countries. Okay. And the consequences of this, things, when we look at these maps, these are called choropleth maps. Students need to know that. A choropleth map. They give you information using colour, choropleth colour. And this one specifically is global literacy rates. So the dark blue is where most people can read or write a basic sentence at the age of 15, over 96%. Whereas again, look at Africa, those numbers are going right down to under 35%. So the red countries like Mali over here, okay, we're talking about countries where less than 35% of them, so 1 in 3 people can read or write, which is absolutely crazy in a modern world, isn't it? Okay, and again, notice that, some of them quite central, so they're landlocked. Maybe there's conflict like in South Sudan and places like that. So those causes we've just been talking about are clearly having an impact here. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, you're generally going to be better off. Okay, same again with life expectancy. Our lower down ones are less than 40. So still places in the world where people live between 45 and 50 years on average, which I think is just crazy. And then we've got countries like us where, we're looking at 80 to 85 years. And some countries like Japan, which has the best life expectancy in the world, which is about 89 or something crazy. Okay, really good diets. They're generally pretty healthy. You don't see many overweight Japanese people, unless they're sumo wrestlers, which is the complete opposite, which confuses my brain. But yeah, generally, again, look at these consequences. Life expectancy considerably different, 30 years difference across this modern world. And the last one is GNI per capita. So the dark ones are where, on average, each person, if you took all the money divided by the population, would get over $50,000. Okay, again, look at like the UAE. Okay, where Dubai is, really small population but ridiculous amount of oil money, and now tourism as well, like in Dubai, and that's going to mean that they've got a really high GNI per capita. Whereas if you're a bigger country with less money, that number's going to be lower, or if you're just a poor country in general, that number's going to be much lower. And in some countries, you can see that's less than $1,000. Okay, a high income country is when we get to about $10,000 plus. Okay, so any of these sort of darker ones are the more sort of high income countries like us, and then the low incomes usually $1,045 or under. So any of the really light sort of pale yellow colours as well. So yeah, that's another consequence. Low GNI, poverty is going to have a massive impact, isn't it, as a result of uneven development. So what are we doing about it? There's different strategies, which include some bottom-up strategies, like aid. Okay, so we've got a farm here in Africa. The project's called Farm Africa in Uganda, where you can donate animals like goats or sheep or pigs, and they can use that. They can get the milk, they can turn it into cheese, they can sell that at a market and start getting jobs. We've also got emergency aid as well, like when Typhoon Haiyan hit. We talked about that earlier in the physical course. Killed 6,201 people. So we provide shelters, try and get them, some cover, try and get them warmer, so we're not getting those secondary impacts like deaths from hypothermia and things like that. So these are quite sort of short-term examples of closing the gap. These aren't going to have a long-term impact. So if I've got my evaluation brain on, I'm thinking these are very short term. They're not going to have an impact in the long term necessarily, unless they're using the money here from this sort of idea of goat aid to reinvest it in education and things like that. Okay, we've got other techniques as well. So developmental aid, for example, building dams in countries. So the Bakun Dam in Malaysia, which we talked about in the physical course, that was gifted by the UK. How nice of us. And they're going to use that to generate electricity so they can power schools and factories and things like that. Tourism, we're going to come back to in a second in more detail. And this idea of TNCs, again, we're going to look at in more detail in the next session. But basically just companies locating in poorer countries like Shell, okay, like McDonald's and Primark, and then giving jobs to people and helping boost the economy as well. But we're going to finish with tourism in Kenya. So we're going to be thinking about the positives and negatives of tourism. So people go and visit there and they spend money. You've got to spend money to go there in the first place. 12.1% of Kenya's GDP, which again means the total amount of money in the country, comes from tourism. So that's quite a big number. It provides 226,500 jobs, heck of a lot. And they can reinvest that money that they're making in conserving the habitats in the savannah, which is the reason people go to Kenya, isn't it, really? Let's be honest, to go on the safaris most of the time. So they're going to reinvest that money to improve that asset that they have. Okay. Negatives, though, a lot of the money doesn't actually benefit the country. If you book a holiday through TUI or Virgin Holidays or any other companies, a lot of the money goes directly to the company and not to the country itself. We call that economic leakage. Okay. Also, if I was going to build a hotel in Kenya, sorry, but I'm not going to employ the local people for my managerial jobs, the big paying ones. I don't trust them. They don't have the education necessarily. Okay, I'm speaking holistically here to help you understand it. I'm not offensive. And so therefore, the locals were going to get the poorly paid jobs, like the cleaners, the waiters, and things like that. So although they're getting jobs, they're not that highly paid. And of course, tourists are going to have an impact on the environment as well. This idea of over-tourism in the savannah. I've seen some crazy pictures of hundreds of people, gathering around tigers, taking pictures. That's going to have a massive negative impact on the biodiversity of the area. And also, if you're going, scuba diving, you might destroy the coral reefs, and there's no coming back from that. And they haven't got the money to regulate that and try and put laws in place to try and protect it either. Again, if we're evaluating and we're thinking critically for those AO3 marks, what's the most significant impact? What's going to have the impact in the short term, the long term? What stakeholders would agree or disagree with you? Okay, so there's those themes here. 100%, if you're going to write anything down, write this down. Okay, just thinking about at least one of these ideas in your paragraph is going to make the difference and get you grades 8 and 9. I promise you. Don't just explain why it's good. Evaluate it. Give your opinion. Okay, what's the best thing? How can you categorize it? At what scale is it having an impact on? Is it helping the area or the whole country? Or is it going to have an impact across the globe? Okay, and here's an example paragraph for you. This is a conclusion that I wrote. So overall, I feel that tourism in Kenya has a positive impact on Kenya's development due to the fact that it generates 12.1% of their GDP. This benefits Kenya nationally, so I'm thinking about scale there, as this revenue can be spent on improving infrastructure such as education and healthcare. This would then have a positive socio-economic impact locally, as residents benefit from these improvements. There is a risk of damaging environmental impacts as a result of tourism, so I've given a counter argument there. But as long as some of this gained revenue is reinvested into conservation, this should outweigh any short-term environmental impacts. So in terms of those themes, okay, these themes here, I've used pretty much all of them, okay, maybe 4 or 5 of them there. And that is going to guarantee me those big marks. Okay, see you on the next session.